Okay, so first of all, really, it was kind of what we set out to do. This project, for those that don't know, was built on the back of a really successful project that our English team at the college run the previous year. So we kind of expanded that and made it more of a joint project between the maths team and ESOL team. And in doing so, we set out for maths specifically to model answers to multi-step questions through encouraging learner participation with visualizers. But then as things changed, and I'll sort of jump a little bit, our secondary aim was to enhance revision materials for functional skills maths. And then ESOL really was about modelling skills for pre-entry learners. So these are learners, for those that might not be aware, that come with, in most cases, zero educational background. They cannot communicate in their own language, let alone use a new language. So that's kind of the aims, and I'll elaborate a bit as we go through. So for maths, the initial focus for us, as we've seen for the past couple of actual exam years, that in GCSE, our learners score very, very poorly on multi-step questions. So what we did was we promoted staff to use visualizers in lessons, and in particular to model exemplar answers to multi-step questions. And then again, jumping ahead a bit, we had a skills facilitator that we have at the college that's used a visualizer to develop a bank of comprehensive videos solving exam questions for functional skills. But again, I'll elaborate a little bit more as we go through. So the first aim, the main focus was breaking down these barriers that our learners had to multi-step questions. So what we did at the start of the academic year was we carry out an initial assessment, and then at various points for our GCSE learners, October, December, March, we would have further assessments. So what we found was that our initial assessment, when there was multi-step questions in there, we found that only 19% of our learners attempted those questions. So a very, very small amount. In most cases, they would look at the question and think, oh, that's too difficult, and they would leave it blank. What we did through the use of modelling was we managed to increase the number of the percentage of learners quite substantially who attempted multi-step questions to around 84% in October. And then December, just before everything went a bit haywire again, we got to 97% of learners attempting these questions. So we see that as a significant improvement, and really due to the project that we run using these visualizers. So I just thought to sort of go into that a little bit more, is that we, within the initial assessment, the second assessment point and the third assessment point, what I'm showing is kind of how those questions progressively get more challenging as well. And I think, you know, the fact that the team had spent some considerable time in demonstrating how to answer questions, how to break things down, how to pull out the information that you need, I think that the results were substantial in terms of the increase in the number of learners attempting the questions. We're not saying that they got full marks, but what we are saying is that actually they didn't shy away from it. They didn't go, oh, look at this, I don't get it, I'll leave it. What they did was they became better at picking out the bits that they could do, and that was really effective. And the way that we kind of tracked it, just because some may be interested, is that we used a question by question tracking sheet. So it's essentially a spreadsheet that we build that matches the actual assessment taking place at that time. Staff put in the score by question, and then what this elaborate sheet does is it breaks it down into, and it's very tiny for you, I would imagine, but it breaks it down into the sort of subsections of what's on the paper. So it could be a number question, a ratio question, but then within that it allocates marks for the multi-step questions as well. And then we provide learners with a feedback sheet on it. This was, of course, everything running really nicely, getting significant improvements as we had hoped, making good use of the visualizer. And then really what happened was there were some staff that used this in our sort of secondary to modelling good answers for uploading revision. I mean, I walked into a classroom with one of my team, and they would write these real elaborate notes, as you can see, that's displayed at the moment. But they would write them every lesson because, unfortunately, we often have to move from class to class, you know, and it was just a real good way of using the visualizer to actually do a print screen. And then you can display that at the start of the following session, or you can upload it to revision, Google Classroom, and email to students as well. So we found that the effectiveness of the visualizer in that sense was excellent as well. What happened next was that we moved on to online learning. And this is kind of, although there was that initial success, and we're really keen to continue that this coming year, we kind of moved to online learning after that third assessment point. And what we found was that because we had installed dual screens in the class, in all classrooms, so staff could present on one screen, you know, have a camera on the other, the visualizer become a bit clunky. And we found that plugging it in, it would override the main camera. And then when you unplugged it to try and get the main camera back, there was technical difficulties. Not all staff were trained up enough to know that you need to click 3 different buttons to get it back. There was a bit of a lack of engagement then with the visualizers from the staff point of view, because obviously they had found these softwares online that were really, really effective, Jamboard, for example, and it all saved in one place. So what we decided to do was not abandon that aspect of the project completely, and it did in fact continue to be used when we did move back to face-to-face. But we did change the focus at that point to basically focus on functional skills, because at this point in time we had had the notification that GCSE's exams would be scrapped and that it will be more centre style assessments that would be created, or and things like that. So we made
sorry to interrupt, you've got 3 minutes left.
That's all right, I'm quick. So we changed the focus from GCSE to functional skills because we were sitting live exams, but we didn't do it in a way that we engaged the use of visualizers in classrooms. So what we did do was we created some revision videos, and these revision videos were uploaded to a Google Classroom, and 117 students joined this and made use of the materials, with quite a few of those feeding back that they could use it at home in a quiet space. I'll skip on to ESOL because I'm sure we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. What we did in ESOL was focus on the pre-entry level groups, those with no skills, no educational background. We use modelling in collaboration with one of the maths teachers that worked closely with the ESOL team. And some of the teachers, well, most of them described it as an absolute lifesaver, having a visualizer. And the reason for that is we had learners that cannot hold a pen, do not know how to log onto a computer, can't open a Microsoft Word document, can't open the internet. And they could model that from the front of the class and project it on the screen. So just by bending the visualizer up, it became a really effective tool so that they could maintain distancing. It was very successful for ESOL. The staff engaged really, really well. It is a smaller team than the maths, but they did take it upon themselves, and a couple in particular really engaged well. The modelling was essential, as I've said, with holding a pen. Learners gave lots of positive feedback, and they really enjoyed having the demonstrations live projected onto a board. They was able to also create new resources and video snapshots. So just an example of them going through a textbook and reading left to right and all of those kind of things that we take for granted. Some learner work. There was some work that Susie had done, which showed the significant increases in their use of grammar, punctuation, and just arrangement and letter formation and all sorts of things. So that worked really well. As a sort of final proposal and for our next steps for maths and ESOL, we want to continue that use to model handwriting, pen holding, demonstrations. We do want to utilise them with learners to ensure that they're able to demonstrate with peers. Obviously, we couldn't do that because of distancing, wiping and disinfecting everything, but hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to allow those to use them. We would need to carry out a wider analysis of the effectiveness of the revision videos, because with all of the panic to get people into exams and returning face to face and so on, it again maybe took a little bit of a sidestep. We need to speak to learners to identify how they may use it to enhance their learning and build more collaboration with the wider college on visualizer use, because I anticipate that there's an awful lot of areas, much the same as myself. Over a year ago, I had no idea what a visualizer was. So I think, there's some work. It's hard to keep up with it.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Mark. That was really interesting. I'm going to very quickly hand over now to Leeds City College and Jess and Johnny. Before I do, for those of you who aren't aware, a visualizer is, for those of you who remember this far back, like an old-fashioned OHP. So it's just a digital version of that, in that you can just write on it and immediately see that feedback. So it's brilliant for annotating and modelling, and yes, so wonderful. So over to you, Jess and Johnny, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That was really interesting.
Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm Johnny Diamond and I'm here with Jess today, and we'll talk about our project that evolved from a key thing, looking at visualizers, but the main thing for our focus was really feedback in GCSE English during remote delivery. Because at the start of COVID, we'd planned for a hybrid model this year. So we're looking at how we can use visualizers at home, really. So our plan was to try and increase engagement with feedback. We've been looking at feedback for a few years at the college, and we've limited success. We've seen that lots of learners don't engage with our feedback strategies. We've tried stamps, we've tried stickers, we've tried star marking, we've tried purple pens, we've tried green pens, blue pens, you name it, we've tried a strategy for feedback. And what we found is that the learners, they just don't go back to it that often. And teachers will try their utmost. They will do reams and reams of feedback. And sometimes the learner will just say, what grade have I got? So we had to try and change the status quo with our feedback strategy, and we thought GCSE English was where we'd start. We originally intended as a project to use visualizers for live feedback and marking, and as well to model answers. But you may well know that we were hit by a high-level cyber attack at the college. So the use of visualizers and the use of adding new tech to our computer systems just wasn't going to work at that current time. So we decided to remove the idea of visualizers, but we were still focusing on a feedback strategy. So we adapted to a more of a formative feedback strategies. So our approach then, at the start of our research, we were using different techniques. So we're looking at using Neopod for feedback, Jamboard, like they said at Suffolk New College. So we've actually got the Jamboards in the rooms, and there's a Jamboard app as well. And we're looking at how can we interact with our learners. Through this, speaking to the teachers as well and speaking to the learners, we decided to narrow down our focus from multiple feedback strategies to focus just on one called Moat. So Moat is a Chrome extension, and then we drilled down further. We looked at using this extension just in our digital and IT department. So with our learners who are very comfortable with technology. And in this department as well, they said they've got a very clear preference for verbal feedback. Now we're going to do a bit more research on this. This is some findings at the end. And what we found from Mo is that it enabled teachers to keep that personal connection with the learners when they were teaching from home, either synchronous or asynchronous. And that it was individual, it wasn't a whole group feedback, personalized. And there was a beep then, but I'll carry on.
Fab, okay, so just for a bit of context in terms of how Moat actually works for anyone who's not come across it before. So once you've installed the Chrome extension, you can essentially add on voice notes to learners' online pieces of work by highlighting specific sections or specific sentences in the same way that you would when you're making a comment on a doc. So then you record yourself saying whatever feedback you want to give, and it comes out looking similar to a comment, really, like you can see on that photo there. And then you just click the play icon to listen to it. And one of the great things about it is that the learners can replay the voice clips over and over again. So they can refer back to it and the feedback later down the line, obviously, like unlike with the normal feedback that they'd usually get in a classroom. And another great feature is that you can also transcribe the audio into text, which is obviously really useful from an accessibility point of view. And then the learners can also translate those transcriptions into their language of choice. But the crux of it, in terms of what we found most impactful, and he was kind of touching on there, was that the learners can hear their teacher's voice and still feel really connected to them even during remote periods. And that's just something that we thought was so important, because at that time, like, a lot of learners were reporting feelings of online isolation and just feeling really demotivated without having that interaction with their teacher. And also, although like things like Jamboard, as we were saying, they were effective, we felt it was Moat and those voice clips that seemed to really capture the human sense of interaction. And that was what the learners really responded to. And then finally on there, Moat is really efficient from a teacher's perspective. We've said that voice commenting is around 3 times quicker than typing out comments. And the teacher who led this trial, she was saying that it allowed her to be really, really specific and go into more detail than she usually would in a lot less time. So that's obviously a win-win. And then on that, I'm conscious of time, so I won't run through each of them, but we've put a selection of typical quotes on there so that you can get a bit of a sense of what the teachers' opinions were towards Moat. So the time-saving element, really came through quite strongly. And also the concept that the learners actually listen to the voice notes, you know, unlike when they sometimes can ignore the feedback, the written feedback that they get in their books. So Johnny, if you want to just leave that up for a moment before you move on, so you can read. So through using Moat then, we have developed our provision of verbal feedback by ensuring that any instruction to the learners was really precise and really engaging. The actual act of recording itself and then the time limit of the 30 seconds of sound bites, it really helps you as a teacher think about the quality of your comments. So you really effectively phrase what you're trying to convey to the learner. And obviously we're sort of waiting on achievement data, but in lieu of that, the trial of Moat seemed to really boost the attendance, and especially during a time in which it was otherwise declining during that remote period. So in digital and IT, by the end of the project, their attendance was 7% higher than the college average, and then 9% higher than the other departments at the same campus. So, you know, we think that's evidence that backs up the things that we had in our student and teacher surveys of their student voice, that they were more engaged because of the feedback that they received through Moat. So the overall impact, I guess, was that we were able to innovate and deliver relevant and meaningful feedback to the learners for the GCSE English work, despite what was a really difficult period. And we've just improved our facility to give effective and personalised feedback when we're online via this resource. Thanks.
Okay then, so the next steps for us is to, we're going to spread this project wider now throughout our GCSE English team. We're in the process of upskilling our staff with the use of Moat. And then from our English teachers, once we're all competent at it, then hopefully a bit of exponential growth there, where we'll have the English teachers supporting the maths teachers, supporting the vocational teachers in how to use this program. We are going to trial online digital assessments with a program called Chromex, and we're going to have voice notes as the primary way to give feedback. And then we're going to look at why do learners prefer verbal feedback? So it's the why. It's something we're not looked at, but it's a very keen thing that they are preferring verbal feedback. Is it they've got low literacy skills, so they struggle with reading? Is it the teachers give them feedback which is potentially using high level language they don't understand? If they don't understand how to answer the question in the first place, is the teacher just reaffirming something that they didn't know? Or are learners like myself quite lazy and they want things instantly? And if somebody can tell me something in 10 seconds, I prefer them reading it in 30. So,
well done, Johnny. You're absolutely right on all of those aspects. As I've just put in notes, it's that immediate gratification as well, isn't it? The fact that they don't have to sit and read, they can get feedback instantaneously and listen to it a couple of times. Right, thank you, Jess and Johnny, that was brilliant. Okay, I'm going to hand straight over now to Rachel from West Suffolk College, please.
Thanks, Helen. I will just find the right screen and share it. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Yeah, good. Okay, so this project was inspired by our observations during that first lockdown, when we noticed that the learners that had formed friendships with each other in the group before lockdown remained the most engaged and supported each other to achieve throughout that period of online learning. So we knew that we were heading into potentially a period of online learning, so wanted to look at how could we help those learners that are learning online to quickly build community and mutually supportive relationships. So just a little overview of what we were doing. So we're part of the adult skills department, so our learners are 19 plus, and the project focused on 12-week intensive online functional skills maths classes. Our first cohort of learners were learners who had specifically opted to study online. Once we had subsequent lockdowns, everyone moved online. So some of those learners were not ones that had chosen to study in that way. We used the college's preferred platform of Teams, and we taught using a flipped learning model. So learners were required to do quite a lot, 2 to 3 hours of pre-class preparation work before coming to the sessions. So we planned opportunities for those learners to spend time together, looking to see how connections would develop. We were attempting to kind of recreate the opportunities that they might have in an in-person classroom. However, difficulties with college logins, slow rollout to Teams meant that we weren't able to trial those small groups in our first cohort. However, updates to Teams, an approach that I'll talk about in a minute, a collaborative approach to induction, meant that for the second cohort, we were able to trial collaborative working. In that second cohort, we also instigated what we called week 0, which I'll speak about more in just a moment. So as I mentioned, that first term didn't necessarily go as planned, with IT issues and also the learners' low level of IT skills becoming apparent. When we reflected on and reviewed that project at the end of the first term, we noticed from the learner surveys and observations that learners who'd met with a tutor before the start of the course were more relaxed, they were less anxious, those groups tended to gel quicker and engage faster with each other and also the material and the learning. This highlighted for us the importance of the impact of the learner-tutor relationship, not just that relationship between each other. We saw that learners who were more comfortable with the technology and with Teams were also less anxious. So as a wider team of staff, so this was managers, admin team, tutors and support staff, we reviewed the enrolment and the induction process. And it was this gathering together that enabled us to review kind of each aspect of it from various angles and to put in place changes that worked for everyone. So the enrolment process was restructured, meaning we could get logins earlier. We created a Padlet of pre-course information, videos and things from tutors. This meant that the learners enrolling on our courses had a greater kind of consistency about expectations. It also meant that the admin team had more knowledge about what we were actually teaching, and then they could advise the learners better beforehand. Week 0 then was a timetabled session for each class, and this was across the department, not just those classes we were looking at for this project, so functional skills maths and English. And the aim of it was to enable those learners to get to know the tutor, get to know other learners, become familiar with the technology, and to gain an understanding of what the course involved before they started. It aimed to make them as prepared as possible, and it consisted of a one-to-one meeting with the tutor and a group session before start of the course. I particularly found this was really time consuming, but really felt that it was worth the investment later on down the line. So as well as week 0, we were also looking in that second cohort at collaborative working. So once we were able to use breakout rooms, instead of just having our hours group teaching session, we had that followed by a break, and then 45 minutes in small fixed groups, so they were the same every week, where those learners worked together to apply their learning. Initially, we used the collaborative area on the Teams notebook. Lots of learners found it very, very difficult to access. We introduced Jamboard after I had a discussion with a tutor from another college who'd used it really successfully. And this was great because I was able to build on her tips already of effective group size and activity structures. Jamboard enabled us to use a wide variety of activities, so matching and sorting tasks like we might have used in class anyway, as well as exam style questions. Although the students enjoyed Jamboard from the outset, we still had to set quite clear expectations around how to use it in order to encourage participation from everyone. Lots of learners commented how it was much easier to work together, and the conversations we went into the breakout rooms that we overheard, they were just of a much richer quality. The learners were really grappling together with what they were doing, grappling with that task, rather than working on their own, waiting for the others to finish, checking their answers and moving on. And then they also started to chat about other things and to get to know each other. So what did we learn? Well, firstly, the learners in that second cohort compared to the first that learned in small fixed groups got to know each other better. So red is that they didn't know each other at all. Green is a little. You'll see from that first group that we never progressed beyond not knowing people or only knowing them a little. But on that second cohort, there's no red whatsoever. And you can see as we carried on, people did feel that they were getting to know each other. The fact that learners knew each other better also seemed to have an impact on their learning. So there's a quote here, and learners spoke about feeling more comfortable with each other. Being with the same people each week seemed to ease their anxieties because they got to know the other learners. They felt comfortable to speak up and explain when they didn't understand something. They started to share ideas and then to ask each other for help. So other things that we have learned. Week 0 appeared to fast track that building of the learner-tutor relationship. So learners that were involved in week 0 were more likely to get in touch with the tutor if they had any issues. They were more likely to speak up in class. Learners reported that week 0 helped them build their IT skills and their knowledge of Teams. And this meant that the learners could hit the ground running after week 0. They were ready to start the course. And reducing learners' anxiety, ensuring they're prepared, meant that they were able to focus on that learning. Achievement appears to be higher for those learners that met in small groups. We're still awaiting final exam results, but results from the milestone assessments throughout the course, they achieved much higher than the others. Retention, however, was actually lower. So we had more people dropping out when we, in theory, perhaps had more support in place. Most of these were in the first couple of weeks or even before the course started. We're thinking that possibly that actually a more thorough induction meant that learners had a better idea of what they were signing up to. They knew what they were committing to. And also I think that feeds through into hopefully higher achievement rates. So the people that stayed, were invested and achieved well. So
thank you,
next.
Rachel.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, go on.
That's fine.
Really quick, you've got about 30 seconds.
Cool. What next? We're going to keep going with our learning. We began by seeking to use our experience of the classroom to improve our online offering. Now we're seeking to use that experience of online learning to guide our classroom-based experience for the learners. So we're going to have a similar week 0 induction in classroom-based courses to encourage that building of supportive relationships as soon as possible and incorporating a digital element. Week 0 will continue again across the whole department, with the induction being compulsory for the functional skills online courses. We've developed standardised materials for all the tutors, and the learners will be given an e-certificate in skills for digital learning. That's the end. Thank you.
Well done. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in like that.
I paused too long.
Thank you. No. Well done. Thank you very much. Okay, last but definitely not least, I'm going to hand over to Mark and Janet from Develop.
Bear with me while I just work out how to share the screen.
Brilliant, thanks Janet. Just as a way of introduction then, we carried out a project last year where we looked particularly at GCSEs and removing grading when we were giving feedback to students, because I think actually Leeds College already indicated the obsession that students have on what the grade is, what the numerical value is, as opposed to what skills they're learning or what skills they need to develop. So we wanted to build on that, and we recognised that because of the cohorts of learners that we engage with, many are school refusers, etc., and have had very negative experiences of education, we have quite a lot accessing learner support assistance, and it was that relationship that we wanted to harness and build the confidence really of the learning support assistants in them having the understanding of the skills that needed to be learned and their understanding of maths and English, and that was our starting point. But I'll hand over to Janet, who will tell you that we went in many different directions from where we intended to go.
Yeah. Right, yes. So we work with 16 plus. Many have got EHCPs, and we work in quite small groups as well. And as I said, as Mark said, exploring the value of the learning support systems. When we started, it was too big, so many changes. We did start with a questionnaire to find out what LSAs and tutors actually thought LSAs did, so which I'll come to in a minute. To begin with, we were looking at English and maths, but that was too big, so let's just focus on maths, and that's when I got brought into the project. And we were going to follow some learners to look at how they thought about things, but then we went into lockdown, and it became difficult really to do that, because I think it's easier when you're making that connection with the learners, which I think has been a theme that I've heard certainly throughout today. The connection is really important. So, you know, COVID lockdown, I think, you know, needs must. You have to find other ways of doing things. So I then realised that actually when I was talking to the tutors that I manage that were teaching maths, that they were being inspirational and coming up with different ways of how they were using their LSAs. So we followed 2 case studies in that way. Anyway, so we will look at what works, what we can learn, and what we can do to help use the best bits. So first of all, I wanted to share with you the sort of word cloud of what LSAs and tutors perspective of what an LSA does. So on the left is what the LSAs thought, and on the right is what the tutors perspective of an LSA role. I think there's some diversity with the two, but also there's the same sentiment. And I think that's interesting. It made me think that maybe tutors don't actually know what an LSA does, and maybe an LSA doesn't completely understand what the tutor's doing. So there's maybe a lack of communication. And I think that's quite important going forward. One of our maths tutors came up with a working guide for her LSAs because she was struggling to know how to communicate what she actually wanted. And I thought this was really interesting. Now, unfortunately, the managers wouldn't allow her to share this with the LSAs, but I do think that this is actually quite a useful model. She was the sort of tutor that very much needed very precise information and very clear ideas. And I think she wanted the LSAs to be role models. And I think she wanted them to inspire the learners so that she could then focus on teaching the weaker learners. So she wanted them to work with the learners that were perhaps a bit better at maths. And she could then devote her time to really supporting those learners that needed a bit more help with the actual maths content. And I think this also links very closely with the growth mindset, which we all know is so important, because we need to open our mind to the fact that we can continue learning. So supervise, hint, suggest, teach. And I think it's quite an interesting model, which I for one would certainly like to take forward. The case study at Hitchin was me, to be fair. I was the tutor. I was the person that had to cover a long-term sick tutor who went off having COVID in December and hasn't come back. And she was teaching all the lessons there. Now, I hadn't taught over there. I didn't know the learners. And then we went into lockdown. So we're now teaching online. And I know how important it is to have that relationship with the learner, to really get them to engage. As Rachel in the previous presentation said, that is just so important to have that relationship. So I built the relationship with the LSAs that did know the learners really well, and they were able to then communicate with the learners and get them online. And by the time I went back into the classroom, of course, they knew who I was, they knew what the expectations were, and then it was much easier to get them to engage. And these learners, certainly the ones that I was teaching at level 2, were quite challenging, even in what I considered to be quite fun interactive lessons. You know, they'd be up and down like blooming yo-yos, but the LSAs knew them and they knew what to do to bring them back and at least get some learning done. And 2 of them certainly have gone on to succeed in their level 1, and we're just waiting for level 2 results to come through. So I'm hopeful. The second case study at Dunstable, the tutor decided, she had 3 LSAs and she had a mixed group of learners from entry 1 right through to entry 3. And when you look at the functional skills maths, there's quite a variation across that. And she'd already got in her mind that she was going to use the LSAs to support particular learners with their needs. COVID and being online basically forced that forward, because there was no way she could teach online 3 groups essentially, who all needed different things. Easier in the classroom, but much harder online. So she basically created a scheme of work for entry 1 and a scheme of work for entry 2, which piggyback on to what she already had for entry 3. And she just gave that to a trainee LSA who'd literally started this year. Of course, she was quite overwhelmed by it to begin with, but then because she was given the autonomy to run with it and to be able to change that, and she had the support and mentorship of the tutor, she felt really enabled to actually be able to teach that learner who went on to level 1. Fantastic.
Janet, sorry to interrupt. You've got 30 seconds left, and then I'm afraid we have to go straight into.
That's perfect. So really, there's lots of things on this slide, and I'm not going to read it all. But listening to Jean McNiff this morning, I think what made me realise is that what we do go on to do next, there are opportunities to learn what we didn't know we needed to know. And I'm not sure that I knew. One of the things that I think the most important thing is that LSAs and tutors need to understand what each other is doing. And we want to now then create some professional training opportunities for them to really understand what each other does so that we can work better as a team. And for me, that's probably the takeaway thing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very glad we managed to wrap that up. We've got about, I don't know, 30 seconds at the most. Does anybody have any questions before we go back to the main session? We unfortunately don't have the security blanket of a break before the next session, but has anybody got anything they'd like to ask before we go? Okay, right, wonderful.
I just have a very last word, which is to thank all the project leads for some fantastic presentations. Actually, I've read the reports of all of the projects, and hearing you all talk about them really helps to clarify some really key learning points and insights. So thank you for taking the trouble to put together those PowerPoints as well as write the reports. And it'd be great. And thanks, Janet, for making some interesting links to what Jean was explored with us just before lunch. So well done to all of you, and some fantastic kind of commentary in the chat pane as well.